The moment I saw Detective Rodriguez standing on my porch with that uncomfortable expression police get when they know they're being used for petty neighborhood disputes, I knew Susan had finally lost her mind completely. "Mr. Edwards, I'm here because we received a complaint about your fence," the detective said, pulling out a small notepad while snow continued to fall around us. It was January in northern Vermont, just outside Burlington, and we'd gotten nearly 3 feet of snow in the past week alone. I rubbed my cold hands together and looked past him toward the fence in question, barely visible under the blanket of white. "What about it?" "The complaint states that your fence is an eyesore and violates HOA regulations." The caller, a Mrs. Susan Henderson, said she's sent you multiple notices and you've refused to comply. I couldn't help the laugh that escaped. "Detective, I'm sorry someone wasted your time with this. That fence marks my property line. I'm not part of any HOA." Rodriguez looked down at his notes, then back at the fence, which ran along the western edge of my 5-acre property. Mrs. Henderson was quite insistent. She said she's the president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA and that you're in violation of several codes. "Come inside for a minute," I said, stepping back from the door. "Let me show you something that'll clear this up real quick." The detective followed me into my home office, stomping snow off his boots on the mat. I pulled out the file folder I kept specifically for dealing with Susan's nonsense over the past 2 years. Inside were my property deed, the original survey from when I bought the place in 2019, and a highlighted map showing exactly where the Meadowbrook Hills HOA boundaries ended. "See this?" I pointed to the survey. "My property line is right here. The fence follows it exactly. The HOA development starts 50 feet west of that fence. I specifically bought this property because it wasn't part of any HOA." Rodriguez studied the documents carefully. "And Mrs. Henderson has contacted you about this before?" "Every month for the past 6 months. Increasingly hostile letters about the fence, my snow removal habits, the color of my house, my truck, you name it. I've ignored them because legally, she has no authority over my property." The detective took photos of the documents with his phone. "Mind if I keep these for reference?" "Take copies," I said, walking over to my printer. While the copier hummed, Rodriguez looked around my office at the various blueprints and construction plans on the walls. "You in construction?" he asked. "Property developer and contractor. Ironic, right? I know property law pretty well, which is exactly why Susan's campaign drives me crazy." After Rodriguez left with the copies and a promise to inform Susan that she was wasting police resources, I stood at my kitchen window and watched him drive away. The fence posts poked through the snow like sentinels, marking the line between my freedom and the manicured prison of Meadowbrook Hills. I'd moved to Vermont from Boston specifically to escape the kind of micromanagement that HOAs represented. My property sat on the very edge of what had once been a larger tract of farmland. The developer who bought most of it had created Meadowbrook Hills, a cookie-cutter neighborhood of identical colonial-style homes with strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to grass height. I'd purchased the last parcel, the one the developer couldn't get because the original farmer's grandson, me, had inherited it from my grandfather. The next morning, I was in my garage workshop building custom cabinets for a client when I heard tires crunching on my driveway. Through the window, I saw Susan's silver Lexus SUV pulling up. She climbed out wearing a puffy white coat and designer boots completely inappropriate for trudging through Vermont snow. I met her at the side door before she could knock. "Susan." "Mr. Edwards, we need to talk about your blatant disrespect for community standards." Her face was already red, and not from the cold. Susan was probably in her mid-50s, with an aggressively styled blonde bob and the kind of pinched expression that suggested she'd spent decades perfecting her disapproving glare. "There's nothing to talk about. Detective Rodriguez and I covered this yesterday. I'm not in your HOA. That fence is an eyesore. It's old, it's ugly, and it's bringing down property values for the entire community. It's on my property, which is not part of your community." Susan pulled out her phone and began scrolling through something. "According to the original development plans filed with the county, all properties in this area are subject to HOA oversight." "Show me." I held out my hand. She angled her phone away. "I don't have to show you anything. I'm informing you that if that fence isn't removed or replaced with an approved design by the end of the month, the HOA will take legal action." "You do that," I said. "My lawyer would love the easy billable hours." Her face turned a deeper shade of red. "You're the problem with this neighborhood. People like you who think rules don't apply to them, who don't care about the community. I'm not part of your community. That's the whole point. We'll see what the judge says about that." She spun on her heel, nearly slipped on a patch of ice, caught herself, and marched back to her Lexus with as much dignity as she could muster. I returned to my workshop, but found it hard to concentrate. Susan's mention of original development plans nagged at me. I was certain of my legal standing, but her confidence bothered me. That evening, I called my lawyer, Tom Mitchell, and explained the situation. "Send me everything you have," Tom said. "Deeds, surveys, any correspondence from the HOA. I'll take a look and make sure we're bulletproof." Over the next few days, Tom did his research while I focused on my work. I had 3 renovation projects going simultaneously: a kitchen remodel in Burlington, a bathroom addition in South Burlington, and a complete first-floor renovation in Essex. The physical work was satisfying, helping me push thoughts of Susan and her HOA vendetta to the back of my mind. Then Tom called with news that made my stomach drop. "So here's the thing," he started. "You're absolutely right that your property isn't in the HOA, clear as day. But I found something interesting in the county records. Susan and the HOA board filed a petition last year trying to expand the HOA boundaries to include your property. It was denied because you didn't consent, but the petition is still technically active." "What does that mean?" "It means they're probably going to push this to court anyway, hoping a judge will see it their way despite the clear property lines. It's a waste of everyone's time and money, but HOAs are notorious for this kind of overreach. Can they win? Not a chance. But they can make your life miserable with the legal process. I'd recommend we send them a cease and desist letter, make it clear that any further harassment will result in a countersuit." "Do it," I said. Tom drafted the letter, and I had it delivered to Susan's house within the Meadowbrook Hills development 2 days later. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The following Saturday, I woke to the sound of chainsaws. I threw on jeans and a jacket and rushed outside to find a tree removal crew on my property, preparing to cut down 3 old maples that stood near the fence line. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I shouted, running toward them. "What are you doing?" The lead guy, a burly man in his 40s with a thick beard, turned off his chainsaw. "We got a work order to remove these trees. They're supposedly dangerous." "Who hired you?" He pulled a work order from his pocket. It had the Meadowbrook Hills HOA letterhead and Susan's signature. "Says here these trees are dead and pose a risk to nearby properties." "Those trees are perfectly healthy and they are on my property. You don't have permission to be here." The crew chief looked uncomfortable. "Look, man, we're just doing the job we were hired for." "I understand, but you need to leave. Now." This is trespassing, and if you cut down even one branch, I'll have to call the police and sue everyone involved. The crew packed up quickly after that, clearly not wanting any part of a legal dispute. As soon as they left, I called Tom. "That's destruction of property," Tom said immediately. "Or attempt anyway. Document everything. Take photos, get the name of the tree service company, get copies of that work order if you can." I managed to get photos of the work order before the crew left and called the tree service company directly. The owner, Mike Patterson, was apologetic. "Mr. Edwards, I'm really sorry about this. Mrs. Henderson has hired us for several jobs in Meadowbrook Hills over the years. She presented this as routine maintenance on HOA property. We had no idea there was a dispute." "I don't blame you," I said, "but I need you to document that she hired you to come onto my property without my permission. I'm building a legal case here." Mike agreed and emailed me a copy of the contract Susan had signed with his company, along with a statement explaining the situation. That evening, Susan called my cell phone. I'd never given her my number, which meant she'd gotten it from somewhere else. Another violation, but a minor one compared to her other actions. "You're going to regret embarrassing me in front of those tree workers," she hissed when I answered. "Susan, you tried to have my trees cut down without permission. That's a crime. Those trees are a hazard. They drop branches into HOA property. They're healthy trees on my property. You have no authority here. This has to stop." "What has to stop is your stubborn refusal to be a good neighbor. Everyone in Meadowbrook Hills is tired of looking at your eyesore of a property. Then they should stop looking. Put up taller privacy fences on your side. That's within your rights. We shouldn't have to. You should maintain your property to community standards." "I maintain my property to my standards, which are the only ones that legally matter. If you contact me again, if you send anyone else to my property, if you keep harassing me, Tom Mitchell will make your life very difficult." I hung up before she could respond. Tom filed an official complaint with the county sheriff's office about the trespassing incident and sent another, stronger cease and desist letter to Susan and the entire HOA board. This time, the letter specifically outlined the attempted tree removal and made it clear that any further violations would result in immediate legal action, including restraining orders and a civil suit for harassment. For about 3 weeks, things were quiet. February rolled in with more snow, and I kept busy with work. The fence remained buried under snowdrifts, barely visible except for the tops of the posts. Then I got the lawsuit. Susan and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA were suing me for, according to the complaint, willful violation of community standards, property value diminishment, and refusing to comply with legally binding HOA regulations. The lawsuit sought to force me to remove the fence, pay fines of $15,000 for previous violations, and cover the HOA's legal fees. Tom read through the entire filing on a video call, his expression shifting between disbelief and amusement. "This is one of the most frivolous lawsuits I've seen in years. They don't have a legal leg to stand on, but we still have to fight it. Oh yeah. We'll file a motion to dismiss, which the judge will almost certainly grant, and then we're going to countersue for harassment, legal fees, and emotional distress. I'm also going to request sanctions against their lawyer for filing such an obviously baseless claim." "Who's their lawyer?" Tom checked the filing. "Someone named Patricia Morrison. Local attorney, does mostly real estate law. I'm honestly surprised she took this case. She should know better." The motion to dismiss hearing was scheduled for late March in Chittenden County Superior Court. As the date approached, I documented everything. Every letter from Susan, every email, every phone call, the tree removal incident, all of it. Tom assured me we had an airtight case, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that comes with any legal proceeding. The week before the hearing, something strange happened. I was coming home from a job site around 7 in the evening when I noticed footprints in the snow leading from the road to my fence and back. Fresh footprints, made within the past hour based on how defined they still were. I followed them to a section of fence about 20 yards from my driveway. Someone had spray-painted HOA property do not cross in red letters across 3 fence slats. The paint was still wet. I took extensive photos from multiple angles, including close-ups showing the paint drips and the footprints. Then I called the sheriff's office and filed a vandalism report. A deputy came out, took his own photos and filled out an official report. "You think you know who did this?" The deputy asked. "I have a pretty good idea, but I can't prove it. I'm in a legal dispute with the HOA president." The deputy nodded knowingly. "HOA drama. We get a lot of calls about that. Most folks don't realize HOAs can't just do whatever they want. This one definitely thinks she can." After the deputy left, I called Tom and sent him the photos. "This might actually help us," he said. "It shows escalating harassment and property damage. I'll add it to our counterclaim." The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not because I was worried about losing. Tom had made it crystal clear we couldn't lose on the merits, but because I knew this was going to drag Susan deeper into her delusion, and I wasn't sure how far she'd take things. The Chittenden County Superior Court was in downtown Burlington, a modern building that always felt too cold no matter the season. Tom met me outside at 8:30, briefcase in hand and confidence radiating from his every movement. "Remember, let me do all the talking," he said. "If the judge asks you something directly, answer clearly and briefly. This should be quick." We entered the courtroom to find Susan already seated at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Patricia Morrison. Morrison was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, and an expression that suggested she knew exactly how weak her case was. Judge Ellen Reeves entered promptly at 9. A sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. We all stood until she was seated, then she looked down at the case file. "I've reviewed the motion to dismiss filed by the defendant," Judge Reeves said. "This seems straightforward, but I'll hear arguments. Miss Morrison, why don't you explain why your clients believe they have standing to regulate Mr. Edwards' property?" Patricia Morrison stood, and I had to give her credit. She presented her argument as convincingly as possible given how terrible it was. She claimed that the spirit of the original land development included all properties in the geographic area, that my fence created a safety hazard by not meeting HOA visibility standards, and that property values for all nearby homes were affected by my refusal to maintain community aesthetics. Judge Reeves listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Morrison finished, the judge turned to Tom. "Mr. Mitchell, your response." Tom stood and calmly dismantled every argument. He presented the property survey showing my land was clearly outside HOA boundaries. He showed the deed with no HOA covenants. He referenced Vermont property law regarding HOA authority. He even presented a report from a structural engineer confirming my fence was safe and well maintained. "Your Honor," Tom concluded, "this is harassment, pure and simple. The plaintiff has no legal authority over my client's property and knows it. This lawsuit is an abuse of the legal system designed to intimidate Mr. Edwards into compliance with rules that don't apply to him. We're asking not only that you dismiss this case, but that you award sanctions against the plaintiff for filing a frivolous lawsuit, and we're prepared to file a substantial counterclaim for harassment and legal fees." Judge Reeves nodded slowly, then looked at Morrison. "Counselor, I'm going to be frank. I don't see any legal basis for your client's claims. Mr. Edwards' property is clearly not within the HOA boundaries. Do you have any evidence to the contrary?" Morrison hesitated. "Your Honor, we believe that the original intent is irrelevant when we have clear property lines and deeds. Do you have any evidence that Mr. Edwards' property is actually within the HOA boundaries?" "No, Your Honor, but then this case is dismissed. Furthermore, I'm awarding Mr. Edwards his legal fees to date and strongly advising your clients to cease any further contact with Mr. Edwards regarding HOA compliance. If I see another case like this cross my desk, I will consider sanctions. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Morrison said quietly. Susan, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly stood up. "This isn't fair. He's destroying our neighborhood." Judge Reeves fixed her with a stern look. "Madam, please sit down. The law is clear here. You cannot enforce HOA rules on property that isn't part of your HOA. If you continue to harass Mr. Edwards, he would be well within his rights to seek a restraining order. I suggest you accept this ruling and move on." Susan sat down hard, her face bright red. I could see her hands shaking with rage. We filed out of the courtroom, and Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "That went as well as it possibly could have. They'll have to pay your legal fees, and they won't dare try this again." "You don't know Susan," I said, watching her storm past us toward the exit without a glance in our direction. I was right to be worried. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early April as the snow was finally starting to melt, I was woken at 6 a.m. by the sound of heavy machinery. I looked out my bedroom window to see a construction crew setting up along the fence line on the HOA side. I pulled on clothes and ran outside. A crew of 6 workers was unloading materials from trucks, concrete barriers, tall wooden fence panels, and equipment for digging post holes. "What's going on?" I asked the foreman. "Building a privacy fence," he said, checking his clipboard. "The HOA wants an 8-foot barrier along this whole property line." "On which side of the fence?" "The HOA side. We're staying completely on their property, don't worry." I relaxed slightly. "Okay, as long as you're on their side, that's fine. But that's my fence you're building next to. Don't damage it." "No problem. We're putting the new fence about 2 feet inside the property line to make sure there are no issues." I watched them work for a while, then went back inside to make coffee. If Susan wanted to waste HOA money building a redundant fence on her side, that was her problem. At least she'd finally be forced to look at something other than my property. The crew worked efficiently, and by the end of the day, they'd installed concrete footings for the posts. Over the next week, I watched the 8-foot wooden privacy fence go up, section by section, completely blocking the view between my property and Meadowbrook Hills. It wasn't until the fence was nearly complete that I realized something was wrong. I was walking along the fence line doing my own inspection when I noticed that in several places, the new fence was actually crossing my property line. Not by much, just a few inches in some spots, but definitely on my side of the boundary markers. I got out my copy of the survey and walked the entire length with a measuring tape. In 4 separate locations, the HOA's new fence encroached on my property, with the worst encroachment being about 8 inches past my fence line. I documented everything with photos and measurements, then called Tom. "They're claiming your land," Tom said immediately. "Even a few inches of encroachment is a property dispute. This might actually be intentional, a way to establish adverse possession claims down the line. They can't seriously think they'll get away with that. We need to act fast. I'll send them a notice that they're trespassing, and they need to move the fence. If they don't respond within 7 days, we'll file for a temporary restraining order and sue for trespassing and property damage. Tom's letter went out the next day via certified mail to Susan, the HOA board, and the construction company. The construction company responded within 24 hours, saying they'd built according to the plans provided by the HOA and would be happy to make corrections once the property dispute was resolved. Susan and the HOA board didn't respond at all. After the 7-day deadline passed, Tom filed for a restraining order and initiated a lawsuit against the HOA for trespassing, property damage, and continuing harassment. We also sent notice to the construction company that they needed to halt any further work until the boundary dispute was resolved. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for May 2nd. In the meantime, the half-finished privacy fence stood as a testament to Susan's obsession with controlling my property. Then things took a darker turn. I came home from a job site on April 28th to find my front door slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it that morning. My heart rate spiked as I pushed the door open slowly, listening for any sound of an intruder still inside. The house was silent. I did a quick walkthrough and found nothing obviously missing or damaged, but someone had definitely been inside. Papers on my desk had been moved. Drawers in my filing cabinet were slightly open when I always kept them closed. Someone had searched my home. I called 911 immediately and didn't touch anything else until the police arrived. This time it wasn't Detective Rodriguez but a different officer, a younger guy named Officer Chen who took the break-in seriously. "Any idea what they might have been looking for?" he asked as he dusted for prints. "Property documents, probably. I'm in a legal dispute with the HOA. They've been harassing me for months." Officer Chen paused. "The HOA broke into your house. I can't prove it, but the timing is suspicious. We have a hearing in a few days about them trespassing on my property. Maybe they were looking for my survey documents or deed, thinking they could make them disappear." "Did they take anything?" I checked carefully. My laptop was still there. My tablet was still there. The TV, tools, everything valuable remained. The only thing disturbed was my file cabinet, and even then, nothing seemed to be missing. "I don't think so," I said finally. "But I keep copies of all my important documents in a safe deposit box at the bank, and I have digital backups. So even if they took something, it won't help them." Officer Chen filed a full report and said they'd check for any security camera footage from neighbors, though my property was isolated enough that it was unlikely. He also recommended I install security cameras, which I'd been meaning to do anyway. That evening, I drove to the hardware store and bought a complete home security system. Cameras covering all entrances, motion sensors, the works. I spent the next day installing everything and linking it all to my phone. If anyone came near my property again, I'd have video evidence. The restraining order hearing arrived, and this time Susan looked noticeably more stressed. Her hair wasn't as perfectly styled, and she wore less makeup. Patricia Morrison was still her attorney, though I noticed Morrison kept a careful distance from her client, speaking to her only when necessary. We presented evidence of the fence encroachment with surveys, photos, and measurements. Tom also brought up the break-in, noting the suspicious timing even though we couldn't prove who was responsible. Judge Reeves, the same judge from the previous hearing, looked increasingly annoyed as the evidence piled up. "Miss Morrison, how does your client explain building a fence that crosses onto Mr. Edwards' property?" "Your Honor, the HOA believed they were building on their own property. Any encroachment was unintentional. The fence crosses the property line in 4 places," Judge Reeves said. "At some point, Unintentional becomes negligent or willful, and this is after I specifically warned everyone in this case to leave Mr. Edwards alone. Miss Henderson, do you understand that you're risking serious legal consequences? Susan stood, ignoring Morrison's attempt to stop her. Your Honor, with all respect, Mr. Edwards is the problem here. He refuses to be part of the community. He's selfish and he doesn't care how his actions affect everyone else. Sit down, Miss Henderson. Your feelings about Mr. Edwards don't give you the right to violate his property rights. I'm granting the restraining order. You and any agents of the HOA are to stay at least 50 feet from Mr. Edwards' property line unless you're correcting the fence encroachment. You have 30 days to move the fence sections that cross the property line. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges. Do you understand? Your Honor, do you understand, Miss Henderson? Yes, Susan said through clenched teeth. As we left the courtroom, Tom was triumphant. She's done. If she violates that restraining order, she'll face criminal charges. But I knew Susan, or at least I thought I did. The look in her eyes as we passed her in the hallway wasn't defeat. It was rage mixed with something that looked like calculation. Over the next 3 weeks, the construction company returned and corrected the fence encroachments under Tom's supervision. Susan stayed away, and the HOA board appointed someone else to handle communications with the construction crew. I thought maybe, finally, this nightmare was ending. Then came the fire. I was at a job site in Burlington when my phone buzzed with a security alert. One of my cameras had detected motion near my garage. I pulled up the live feed and saw smoke. I called 911 while running to my truck. There's a fire at my property. I'm seeing smoke from my garage on my security cameras. I broke every speed limit getting home, arriving just as the fire trucks did. Smoke poured from my garage workshop, thick and black. Firefighters deployed hoses and had the fire under control within 20 minutes, but the damage was extensive. My entire workshop, full of tools and equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars, was destroyed. The fire investigator, a woman named Linda Carter, walked the scene carefully once it was safe to enter. I showed her my security camera footage on my phone while we waited for her preliminary report. The footage showed a figure approaching the garage around 1 p.m., wearing dark clothes and a hood that obscured their face. The person carried something. It looked like a container of some kind, and entered through the side door, which I always kept locked. 2 minutes later, smoke began billowing out and the figure ran away. That's arson, Linda said immediately. Clear as day. I'll need to take this footage and include it in my report. Do your cameras cover the street? I switched to the front camera feed. The footage showed a silver Lexus SUV parked on the road about 100 yards from my driveway. After the fire started, the hooded figure ran to the SUV and drove away. The license plate was partially visible in one frame. That's Susan Henderson's car, I said, my hands shaking as adrenaline flooded my system. She's the HOA president who's been harassing me. Linda's expression hardened. The police are going to want to see this. Don't share it with anyone else until they've secured copies. Detective Rodriguez arrived within an hour and I showed him everything. The break-in report, the harassment history, the lawsuits, the restraining order, and finally the security footage of the arson and Susan's car. This is attempted murder, Rodriguez said quietly. You could have been home. And even if not, arson with this level of planning and intent is a serious felony. We're going to arrest Miss Henderson today. Can you prove it was her and not just her car? We have the car on camera at the scene. We have documentation of her harassment and motive, and we'll get a warrant to search her property for the clothes and gas can or whatever accelerant was used. If we find it, We've got her. Rodriguez left with copies of all my footage. I sat on my porch, staring at the charred remains of my garage, trying to process what had just happened. Susan had actually committed arson. She'd burned down my workshop because she couldn't control my property. 2 hours later, Rodriguez called. We arrested her. She denied everything, but we got a warrant for her house and car. Found a gas can in her garage that matches the one in your footage, dark hoodie with some kind of accelerant residue on it, and a pair of shoes with mud and ash that we'll test against samples from your property. What happens now? She'll be arraigned tomorrow. Given the evidence, I expect she'll be held on bail. The DA will decide on exact charges, but we're looking at first-degree arson, criminal trespass, violation of a restraining order, possibly attempted murder depending on how the DA wants to charge it. Jesus, I muttered. Yeah, this woman completely lost it. I've seen HOA disputes before, but this is next level. That night, I stayed with my friend Dave in Burlington, not wanting to be alone at my property. The news spread fast through the community. By the next morning, the Burlington Free Press was running the story. HOA president arrested for arson in property dispute. Susan's arraignment was brief. The judge, seeing the evidence and her history of violating the previous restraining order, set bail at $500,000. Susan's husband, a quiet man I'd only seen a handful of times, sat in the courtroom looking shell-shocked. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and removed Susan as president, issuing a public statement apologizing to me and making it clear she'd been acting without board approval. They also offered to cover all damages to my garage and workshop, though Tom advised me that any settlement should be part of a comprehensive agreement that ended all disputes. Over the next few months, the legal process ground forward. Susan's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA wasn't interested in being lenient given the clear premeditation and the fact that Susan had violated a court order. The trial began in September at the Chittenden County Superior Court. I testified about the months of harassment, the lawsuits, the fence disputes, all of it. The security footage was played multiple times. The forensic evidence linking Susan to the arson was presented. The gas can with her fingerprints, the clothing with accelerant residue, shoe prints matching her boots. Susan's defense was that she'd been under extreme stress and hadn't been thinking clearly, that she'd only meant to send me a message by damaging my workshop, not hurt anyone. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of testimony and less than 4 hours of deliberation, they came back with a verdict: guilty of first-degree arson, guilty of criminal trespass, guilty of violating a restraining order. The sentencing hearing was in October. Susan's lawyer pleaded for leniency, citing her previously clean record and her mental state. The prosecutor argued that she'd engaged in a months-long campaign of harassment that culminated in a violent felony. Judge Reeves, presiding once again, was unequivocal in her sentencing remarks. Miss Henderson, you had multiple opportunities to accept that you had no legal authority over Mr. Edwards' property. You were warned by this court. You were given a restraining order. Instead of accepting the law, you chose to escalate to violence. You set fire to his property, destroying his livelihood and putting lives at risk. This was not an impulsive act, but a calculated crime born from your inability to accept that you don't control everything in your neighborhood. Susan was sentenced to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5. She was also ordered to pay full restitution for all damages, including my destroyed tools and equipment, lost income during repairs, and my legal fees throughout the entire ordeal. As deputies led Susan from the courtroom, She looked at me one last time. Her expression wasn't anger anymore. It was empty, like she still couldn't quite believe that her obsession with controlling my fence had led her here. The HOA settled with me out of court for all civil claims, paying for complete reconstruction of my garage and workshop, replacing all my destroyed equipment, and compensating me for lost income. They also agreed to remove the privacy fence they'd built entirely, restoring the sight line to my original fence that had started all of this. By December, almost exactly a year after Detective Rodriguez first showed up at my door about a snow-covered fence, my new workshop was finished. I'd upgraded everything, better tools, better layout, and a state-of-the-art fire suppression system. I stood in my driveway on the first real snowfall of the season, watching the flakes settle on the fence posts that marked where the Meadowbrook Hills HOA ended and my property began. The same fence that Susan had fixated on, the same fence she'd called the police about multiple times, the same fence that had, in her twisted logic, justified everything she'd done. Dave came over that evening with a 6-pack of beer. We sat in my new workshop, warm and dry while snow fell outside. "You think they'll ever bother you again?" he asked. The new HOA president already sent me a letter apologizing and making it clear they understand the property boundaries. I think Susan's arrest scared everyone straight. Good. You going to do anything with your property now that it's all settled? I looked out at my 5 acres of land, free and clear, with no one to tell me what color to paint my house or how tall to let my grass grow or what kind of fence I could build. "Yeah," I said. "Whatever I want." Dave laughed and raised his beer. "I'll drink to that." We clinked bottles, and I felt the tension of the past year finally starting to release. The legal fight had cost me time, money, and peace of mind. Susan's arson had destroyed my workspace and could have killed me. But through it all, I'd stood firm on the simple principle that my property was mine, and no one had the right to control it without my consent. The fence outside, gradually disappearing under fresh snow, would continue to mark that boundary. But now everyone understood what it represented. Not just a property line, but the limit of one person's authority over another. A week before Christmas, I was finishing up a kitchen renovation in Essex when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, still wary after everything with Susan, but something made me pick up. "Mr. Edwards, this is Patricia Morrison. I was Susan Henderson's attorney." I tensed. "What can I do for you?" I wanted to apologize. I should never have taken that first case. The property lines were clear, but Susan was so insistent and the HOA board was backing her. I convinced myself there might be some legal angle. There wasn't. I should have told them no from the start. "Okay," I said, not sure what else to say. "I also wanted you to know that Susan's husband, Greg, is filing for divorce. He's completely mortified by everything she did. He never knew about most of it until the police arrested her. I believe that. I only saw him a handful of times over the years. He asked me to pass along his apologies too. He's selling their house in Meadowbrook Hills and moving. He can't face the neighbors after everything that happened." After Morrison hung up, I sat in my truck for a while, thinking about how a simple fence dispute had destroyed Susan's life. 8 years in prison, her marriage ending, her reputation ruined. All because she couldn't accept that she didn't have authority over my property. Part of me felt bad for her. Mental health issues, maybe, or just an overwhelming need for control that spiraled into obsession. But mostly I felt relief that it was over and vindication that I'd stood my ground. The new year came, and with it, a fresh start. I took on new projects, expanded my business, and started dating someone I'd met at a coffee shop in Burlington, a woman named Brenda Taylor who worked as a civil engineer. When I told her the whole story about Susan and the HOA, she laughed in disbelief. That actually happened. I thought those HOA horror stories were exaggerated. Every word is true. I've got the court transcripts to prove it. Well, I'll make you a promise right now. I will never, ever try to tell you what to do with your fence. That's all I ask, I said, and we both laughed. By spring, the snow had melted completely, revealing my fence in all its simple, ordinary glory. The HOA had removed their privacy fence as agreed, so once again my fence stood alone, marking the boundary. I repaired a few sections that had weathered over the winter and gave the whole thing a fresh coat of sealant. It wasn't fancy, just a basic split-rail fence that my grandfather had helped me build years ago when I first inherited the property. But it had become symbolic of something much larger. The right to own property without unwarranted interference, the importance of clear boundaries, and the dangers of unchecked authority. A new family moved into Susan's old house in Meadowbrook Hills, a young couple with 2 small kids. I met them at the grocery store in Burlington one day, and they recognized me from news articles. "We heard about everything that happened," the husband said. "The HOA gave us a very thorough orientation when we moved in. They were extremely clear about where their authority ends." "That's good to hear. For what it's worth, we think your property looks great. Very Vermont, you know, natural and not overdone." "Thanks, I appreciate that." As I drove home that day, I realized that Susan's actions had probably done more to educate people about property rights and HOA limitations than any legal seminar could have. Her case had been covered in local news, picked up by national HOA reform advocates, and even featured in a legal journal article about HOA overreach. In trying to force her will on my property, she'd instead created a cautionary tale that would benefit property owners dealing with similar issues for years to come. My workshop was busy through the summer. I hired an assistant, a young guy named Jake, who was learning the contracting trade. On slow afternoons, he'd ask me about the fence and the whole saga with Susan. "Did you ever think about just giving in?" he asked once. "Like, just to make it easier." "Every single day," I admitted. "Legal battles are exhausting, but the principle mattered more than the convenience." If I'd given in, Susan would have kept pushing, kept expanding her authority, and someone else would have had to fight the same battle later. So you were like taking one for the team, more like defending my team, which is me and my property. But yeah, something like that. In August, I received a letter from a property rights advocacy group asking if I'd be willing to speak at a seminar about dealing with HOA disputes. They wanted to use my case as an example of proper documentation and legal response to harassment. I agreed and spent an afternoon in Burlington talking to about 50 homeowners who were dealing with their own HOA issues, none as extreme as mine, thankfully. I walked them through everything: keeping detailed records, knowing your property documents, having a good lawyer, installing security systems, and most importantly, standing firm when you're legally in the right. After the seminar, several people thanked me for sharing my experience. One older woman, probably in her 70s, shook my hand with tears in her eyes. "My HOA has been trying to force me to remove my garden because they say it's not aesthetically pleasing," she said. "I've been growing vegetables there for 30 years, since before the HOA even existed. After hearing your story, I'm going to fight them properly instead of just letting them bully me." "Good," I said. "Make sure you have documentation showing your garden predates the HOA. That'll be key." Driving home that evening, I felt good about how things had turned out. Yes, I'd lost a year of my life to stress and legal battles. Yes, I'd had my property damaged and my sense of security violated. But I'd won, completely and decisively, and maybe I'd helped others along the way. The fence stood in my rearview mirror as I pulled up my driveway, solid and straight, marking boundaries that everyone now respected. It would stand there for years to come, a quiet reminder that property rights matter, that laws exist for good reasons, and that sometimes the right thing to do is simply to hold your ground. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn, I reflected on how much had changed since that snowy January morning when Detective Rodriguez first appeared at my door. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA had completely restructured their board, implemented new oversight procedures, and from what I heard through the grapevine, they'd become much more cautious about exercising their authority even within their legitimate boundaries. Property values in the development hadn't suffered at all from my non-conforming fence, despite Susan's dire predictions. In fact, several residents later told me they appreciated knowing there was someone nearby who wasn't subject to the HOA's sometimes excessive rules. It's like a reminder that freedom exists just beyond our borders. One neighbor joked when we ran into each other at the hardware store. I continued my contracting work, my business thriving. The publicity from the case had actually helped. People trusted someone who'd stood up for property rights and who clearly knew property law inside and out. I found myself being consulted on boundary disputes and HOA issues more frequently, though I always recommended people get proper legal counsel. Brenda and I got more serious, and by October, she was spending most weekends at my place. She loved the property, the space, the freedom from neighborhood restrictions. I grew up in an HOA, she told me one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. My parents got fined once for having our car parked in the driveway overnight instead of in the garage. This is so much better. You ever want to live somewhere with an HOA again? I asked. Absolutely not. When we build our life together, it's going to be somewhere just like this. I noticed she said when, not if, and I smiled. As winter approached again, nearly 2 years after the whole saga began, I found myself walking the fence line one afternoon, checking for any repairs needed before the snow came. The fence was solid, well-maintained, exactly where it had always been. I thought about Susan, serving her sentence at the Women's Correctional Facility in Waterbury. I wondered if she'd gained any perspective on what she'd done, or if she still believed she'd been in the right somehow. I doubted I'd ever know. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Mitchell. Restitution payment came through. Account should update tomorrow. We're officially done with all financial matters related to the Henderson case. I texted back a thumbs up and a thank you. Tom had been worth every penny, patient and thorough, and willing to fight for as long as it took. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across my property. My property, free and clear, with no liens, no HOA covenants, no restrictions beyond basic municipal codes that any property owner had to follow. Exactly the way I wanted it. I headed back to the house, where Brenda was cooking dinner and the smell of garlic and herbs drifted through the windows. My new workshop was warm and organized, ready for tomorrow's projects. My home was secure, surrounded by cameras and motion sensors, though I hoped I'd never need them again. The fence remained as it always had, marking the line between the Meadowbrook Hills HOA and my freedom. It had withstood winter snows, legal battles, and an arson attack. It would stand for many more years to come, a simple structure that had become something more, a boundary, a symbol, a statement. As I reached the porch, I looked back one more time at the fence line. The last rays of sunlight caught the wood grain, highlighting the weathering and the character that came with age. It wasn't the prettiest fence in Vermont, and it didn't conform to any HOA aesthetic standards. But it was mine, on my property, marking my boundaries. And that, I thought as I headed inside to dinner, was all that mattered. The snow would come again soon, covering the fence and the ground around it, but beneath that winter blanket, the property lines would remain exactly where they'd always been. No amount of harassment, legal maneuvering, or criminal action had changed that fundamental truth. The fence marked where the HOA's authority ended and where my liberty began. Susan had learned that lesson the hard way, at a terrible cost. I hoped others would learn it more gently through her example and spare themselves and their neighbors the pain of similar conflicts. The door closed behind me, shutting out the cooling evening air. Inside was warmth, companionship, security. Outside was my land, my fence, my boundaries. Both were exactly where I wanted them to be, and after everything I'd been through, I'd never take that for granted again.